You're in the water loop. Waterloop.
Waterloop is a nonprofit media outlet made possible in part by a grant from Springpoint Partners. Visit waterloop.org for all of our content. This is Waterloop episode number 134, Utah's Cold Shoulder to Conservation. Utah is one of the driest states in the U.S., and the strain on water resources is growing as its population booms and climate change fuels aridification across the American West. But instead of aggressively advancing water conservation as other states are doing, Utah is brazenly rejecting those approaches and pursuing costly infrastructure projects like pipelines, a situation covered by Mark Olalde, a reporter for ProPublica. In this episode, Mark discusses his story, the outsized influence of water districts and lobbyists on state policy, and examples of how Utah has shunned conservation measures such as demand management, native landscaping, and water loss tracking.
You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis, joined for this episode by Mark Olalde. He is a reporter for ProPublica, and he wrote a story that caught my attention about water conservation in Utah. And the headline of his story is Why the Second Driest State Rejects Water Conservation. Mark, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it really caught my attention because, as we know, there is a lot of water scarcity across the American West, in the Colorado River Basin and California and all across the region, getting worse, exacerbated by climate change. You know, it's hard to call it drought anymore. It's more like aridification, right? And I see a lot of movement in states to towards water efficiency, towards water conservation, putting a lot of measures in place. So it really jumps out that that's not the case in Utah. Maybe before we dive into details, could you kind of give the bottom line, your nut graph, if you will, of what this story's about?
Absolutely. The story kind of set out to answer this question of, in a time of climate change, in a time of, large scale aridification, as like you mentioned, some people are calling it, why is Utah somewhat of an outlier? Why is Utah not doing more? Why do we see all these news stories come out of Vegas for, making every blade of grass kind of public enemy, and yet we're just not seeing that in Utah. So the idea was, let's kind of dig into that question. Let's figure out what's going on with regards to policy, lobbying, et cetera there. And, what emerged was obviously what we'll talk about, which was a picture of a state that, understands these problems are real, but doesn't seem to want to fight too hard yet to solve them.
All right, I guess we'll dive into this here. Maybe you could give a picture of kind of the water situation in Utah. What's it look like as far as their resources, supply, demand, consumption?
Well, Utah's got some of the highest water use because it's got, in part because it's got some of the lowest water rates. There are obviously other factors kind of pushing high water use. But what we do know is that if you look at metrics like GPCD, gallons per capita per day consumption, Utah is right among the highest users in the country. Obviously, a lot of Utah's water use is agricultural, just like anywhere in the West. I focused a bit more on the municipal because there's a lot more movement there for kind of individual policy decisions in terms of water, water conservation. But Utah's not doing great. I mean, it's 20 years into drought, just like, much of the West and Southwest. The Great Salt Lake is at its lowest, recorded point, which is leading, which means water policy questions are leading to air pollution and things like that from more exposed toxic dust in that lake bed. So there are a lot of downstream impacts of the high water use and low water conservation in Utah. One thing we try to do to kind of dig into this question of how is Utah, different or what makes it unique in the Southwestern and the Western water world was look at this question of turf removal, kind of lawn and other grass removal programs which have become a very popular way of reducing that demand side for water. And what we found was comparing Utah's population centers to Las Vegas, Clark County, and Nevada, was we found that Vegas had removed about 200 million square feet of turf and spent about $258 million, at least as of a couple months ago, to do that removal. And now they're paying up to $3 a square foot to remove more grass. But you compare that to what's happening in the largest water district in Utah, in the Wasatch Front, which is the Central Utah Water Conservancy District. They just launched a program last year. At the time that I wrote the story a few months ago, they had only removed, I believe it was 15,400 square feet. So, just pales in comparison. And, we're paying up to a little more than $1, so more than half less than what Vegas was willing to pay per square foot. So just kind of really paled in comparison. And that was just one example in the broader demand reduction world. But what we found was essentially Utah is years behind other states in terms of implementing water conservation policies.
I figured that to do this story, you're looking at those other states. You're looking at the types of practices they put in. You just mentioned that great example of what they're doing in Vegas with turf removal. How would you describe the more typical approach by states out there in the West, Colorado, Arizona, where you are, New Mexico? What's their more typical approach you see to this demand reduction conservation issue?
I think typical is kind of difficult in 2022 in the West, but I think what would be typical is you address the low hanging fruit, right? You address turf removal, you implement low flow mandates on toilet, showers, sinks, things like that, and really you just don't have kind of backwards policies. A lot of cities, municipalities in Utah right now still have mandates that you have to have grass. So we're not even talking, saying you can't have grass. We're saying you have to have grass. And so that's a fight that's going on currently in the almost finished 2022 general session in the Utah legislature. And there was an attempt to write a preemption saying municipalities, HOAs, et cetera, can't mandate grass. They have to give another thing that landscaping can be, whether that's xeriscaping, or any other option. And I think it's going to fail. I think that bill is not going to this year. And it's not like that's some super progressive idea saying you can't mandate grass. You must allow a private landowner or homeowner to put a cactus if they want in their front yard instead of turf. And I at this point there's a little bit left in the session, but that bill has been so far blocked. So that's kind of just to show how different Utah is. And on the other end of the kind of extreme, in my last job, I was reporting in Southern California, and I was reporting on the Salton Sea. And I'm sure your viewers and listeners are, are aware of that issue. But to get within its Colorado River allocation, California took a massive cut, knowingly created a massive public health crisis around the Salton Sea, because taking that cut to its allocation meant the Salton Sea was going to largely dry up, leading to toxic dust, kind of what we're seeing around the Great Salt Lake as well. But they decided that it was better to spend billions of dollars to try to address that public health issue that they created, so they could get their Colorado River allocation down kind of back within their means. So, if you want to see a super aggressive example of what some places are willing to do, those are the lengths that other states are willing to go at this point in time.
So Utah is not pushing toward water conservation. What are they pushing toward then? I think this is something your story goes into in great detail and kind of unveils what levers are being pulled and pushed there.
Yeah, it's still It's still a small community of kind of water managers. They're called the water buffaloes. It's kind of the old timey phrase that's still kicking around, and they seem to really like big water infrastructure projects. They're still pushing for a couple. The two I highlighted in my story were the Bear River Development Project, which would take water from the Bear River along the where Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah kind of their borders, and bring that down towards the population centers around the Wasatch Front. The problem there, though, is that the Bear River is the main tributary feeding into the Great Salt Lake. And so there's all of this attention being paid to the decline of the Great Salt Lake at the moment. But I think the kind of obvious question there is, if you're going to address the decline of the Great Salt Lake, how can you also even consider taking water from its main tributary? The other project I looked into was the Lake Powell pipeline, which could arguably be the most controversial water project in the West, right now. And that's the proposal to build a 100-mile plus pipeline from Lake Powell behind the Glen Canyon Dam and bring it along the Utah-Arizona border to the St. George area, as that area just kind of booms at the moment. And that would bring roughly 85,000 acre feet a year at its peak to that area. But that's pulling water from the main stem of the Colorado River. That's pulling water from one of the two major reservoirs on the river that are already shrinking. We see the bathtub ring photos all the time. And so that project actually, which still could be years away if it ever happens, that project actually already has some pretty stiff opposition from the other basin states. The 6 other basin states actually came together not that long ago and jointly signed a letter to the Department of the Interior to kind of suggest, hey, if you permit this project, you might have to see a lawsuit from the rest of us. And the basin states can't typically decide what they're going to order for lunch. And so at this point, if they're deciding that they don't like this project, all of them together except for Utah, that kind of shows some pretty big animosity, I think, right there. So the larger projects that are being pushed by Utah's kind of water power players are not without their opposition at this stage.
So these power players, the people that are kind of pushing these decisions, are really influencing them. Your story gets at how they have tremendous influence in the state legislature and in the state government, and where a lot of these calls are ultimately made, where obviously laws and stuff are coming out of the state legislature. So it might not have the state's best interest in mind here. These seem to be people that profit, if you will, from some of these water infrastructure projects. Is that kind of what the story gets into? Is that the scenario that's happening there?
I got to be honest. The question of motivation is still a bit unclear. There's not bags of cash being handed around here, and water in the West, as you know, can be ideological, and you have a position and you're not going to back down on that. You've made your name fighting for a project or what have you. So, there is a lot of that going on, but there is. So the way that these kind of major power players tell the story is that the last governor, the former governor of Utah, actually sat them down a few years ago and said, hey, we're growing quickly. Our economy is booming. Our population is booming. Water will not be the limiting factor. So you all need to figure that out and make sure, we do not run out of water. And they kind of took that as their mandate. And so, hence was born this group called Prep 60, which stands for kind of preparing for 2060, when the population is expected to double. And so, they're saying, how do we make sure that this request for water, is heeded? And they firmly believe that it cannot be achieved by conserving water alone, that it has to be achieved by unlocking kind of new water, through these projects, Whereas on the other side of this debate, you have conservationists, environmentalists, tribes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, saying, new water in this day and age is not really something that the state's going to get, or legally the state might not even be entitled to new water. But what I did find in reporting this is that there is a ton of overlap between kind of some of the state structures and some of these so-called water buffaloes, these water district general managers, their lobbyists, et cetera. And so they do hold a ton of sway. The Colorado River kind of negotiating team from Utah is now headed up by Gene Shawcroft, who's also the general manager of the largest water district in the state, who also has been sitting on the legislative committee that is in charge with advancing water bills. And so, I think right there is a telling example. You've got one person who's wearing all these different hats, and also you've got a legislative committee that has non-elected officials sitting on it. They're not voting members, but they have a seat at that table, which is not how it works in other legislative bodies. And so, there's a lot of overlap in this small community that kind of decides where the state goes in a lot of its water policy.
Yeah, you mentioned lobbyists. You said that there. Who are they representing? These lobbyists?
Well, it's interesting because I kind of keyed in on this specific lobbyist as kind of a case study. This gentleman named Fred Finlinson, who spent is a Republican who spent years in the legislature, was a powerful legislator, a state senator, and is actually now married to another powerful former legislator, and she is the assistant general manager at the Central Utah Water Conservancy District. He is the lobbyist for that water district and all of the other main water districts in the state. And so, like I said, it's this small group that has worked together for years. They're pretty much all part of the kind of Republican establishment in Utah. And so part of the story was frankly just trying to fight for a little bit of transparency in how these decisions were even made.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've talked a little bit already about ways that some of the water conservation measures have been rejected, some of the projects that get supported instead, like this Lake Powell pipeline concept. Could you talk maybe about some of the negative impacts of pursuing infrastructure over conservation in Utah, and not just within Utah, but to the neighboring states as well?
Well, absolutely. At this point, it's a zero-sum game, right? On the Colorado, it's not like we've got just an abundance, a huge excess of water there. The river, doesn't flow to the Sea of Cortez, hasn't in years. So we use all of it. I think that the main loss here is that there's a lot of water that the state could have if it wanted to conserve a little bit, if it wanted to spend money there. It's not, it's impossible to tell right now whether conservation alone would truly be enough to satiate Utah's growth. I don't have an answer for that, but I do know that there's just a ton of water that they're not saving like they could be. I think a great example of that was this fight over secondary water metering. And this is, I guess you could call it a success story now, because there is a bill to say that this outdoor water in the state needs to have meters on it now, because studies have shown that putting meters on this water, leads to massive savings. 25% reduction almost in outdoor water use if you just put a meter on these outdoor connections. And this fight to include these meters, get this essentially, cheap water savings, was championed by conservative Republicans for several years and lobbied against and, didn't pass. And it's finally kind of looks like it's going to happen this year. And now it's being it's being held up by the establishment in Utah as this big, great thing they're doing. But they're only doing it because the feds are paying for it. They're doing it through COVID-19 recovery, funding, from the Biden administration. It's not like it's something that they would have allowed to happen a couple of years ago. So there's just all these opportunities for water savings that are, that we're just kind of watching flow by, that could increase Utah's water resiliency, that could decrease kind of per capita usage, that could potentially decrease some of this animosity among the states as they negotiate over the future of the Colorado River, and not really great reasons for why some of these conservation measures are not approved and not pushed forward.
So advocates for water conservation, environmentalists, others have not been happy with the direction. I think that kind of was touched on. You could touch on that more. I'm also curious about the reaction to your story. Right, you're putting some of these inner workings out there through your great reporting, and kind of exposing the way some of this works. So I'm curious to hear about the reaction to your piece as well.
Yeah, I think a little bit of the reaction was kind of, this was an open secret. I did not discover that water policy in Utah is largely controlled by the powers that be, the more conservative aspects of the GOP, this kind of water districts and the water general managers. But I think there was some surprise at some of what I was able to find, kind of the brashness, I would say, of some of the communications around this, some of the attitude that's taken around this. The outgoing, I was able to get access to a lot of internal communications between lobbyists and general managers of the main water districts, so we found examples of, how kind of they treated water policy. There was the general manager of the Washington County Water Conservancy District, kind of some of the main proponents for the Lake Powell pipeline out in the St. George area. I found emails from them for this general manager's retirement party saying, congrats on a job well done for doing your best to cover the red sands of Washington County with water. Which I think kind of was telling in the question of, well, should you be covering the sands of the desert in water? Is there a better way that you could be doing this? Should this kind of policy making be praised? And just how connected some of these players were. Like I said, the husband and wife team were some of the most powerful people in Utah water. I think the level of that connection was interesting. I found that the connection between the lobbying firm and the wife and this husband and wife team was scrubbed from a state government website after conservationists started asking questions about it, leading to kind of questions of why that was allowed to happen. So, I think the kind of proving the level of influence certainly raised some eyebrows in response to the story.
Yeah, sure. So, I wanted to ask about kind of the current trajectory of water management in Utah. You mentioned that this secondary, metering is probably going to go through, but what does kind of the near future look like? More of the same, or what's your read on that?
It's a mixed bag. There are some, the drought has gotten bad enough that even the climate change denying Utah legislature is acknowledging, there's still a lot of calls to pray for this to just be fixed. And I don't want to take aim at religion, but I would say that, we need a little bit more down to earth solutions as well. And so it's kind of disheartening to see that there's a lot of emphasis paid to those types of solutions as opposed to more like, let's put meters on water connections. There were a few bills that I kind of pulled out when thinking about this question that are currently up for debate. like I mentioned, water metering looks like it will go forward, and that will lead to a ton of water savings. But again, that had to be paid for by the feds before the state was okay with it. This idea of halting HOAs, cities, towns, etc., from mandating lawns when you're living in an arid climate. It's good that that's gotten some traction this year, but even with how bad the drought is, how hot things are, how dry things are, that still, like I said, looks like it might not pass. It's still got a little bit of time, but right now it looks like it might not pass. There is another bill that has been put forward by a Republican in the House to mandate some kind of water cuts and more water conservation efforts specifically at state buildings. And that looks like it likely will pass. That won't make a huge dent in like overall water usage, but that will finally show some leadership from the state saying, hey, we're doing this at state buildings. Maybe let's do it at LDS wards. Maybe let's do it at schools. Maybe let's do it at residential. So that is a positive step. There was a bill on in-stream water flows that passed, again, a House Republican there, and that's saying, let's allow kind of beneficial use. So, we can keep water in streams. We don't have to use it. We don't have to dump it on a field that we're not going to harvest just so we don't lose our water rights. Maybe it can go to help save the Great Salt Lake, et cetera. And so there's, but then at the same time, one of the bills that I followed super closely in my story, it was called HB 40 from Representative Melissa Ballard, a Republican in North Salt Lake, that was going to mandate more auditing, more studies of leaks and other water loss in water systems. Utah does a terrible job of knowing where it loses water. Systems lose up to 10% or maybe more. Who really knows of their water due to leaks and other kind of unmeasured uses? And so Representative Ballard has for the past couple of years been pushing for a bill to say, guys, let's start using industry standard leak detection. Let's at least know where the leaks are. And then let's make some plans to patch up these pipes or whatever, however you need to address the leaks as kind of a common sense. Let's just keep the water in the pipes and not lose this water that's been treated, that's been put in the system, et cetera. That failed. The Prep 60 crew came in and rewrote it. It failed again when rural water districts opposed it. She brought it up again this year for a third time. It failed. And this wasn't some, huge draconian effort. This was let's figure out what water we're losing to leaks and where. Wow. And even that couldn't pass on the third attempt in the midst of everything that's going on. So there is definitely an urgency in the Capitol that wasn't there a few years ago. There's definitely an acknowledgement of how bad the problem has been getting. And there's definitely some steps being taken. But, when we see Vegas just declaring war on grass, we're not fully seeing that level of commitment in Utah yet.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Well, I really appreciated your story. I'm glad I had a chance to catch up with you and talk about it a little bit. It's just important stuff out there to have this kind of look at what's going on with water in this day and age. So, Mark, thank you so very much.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Waterloop.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and thanks again to Spring Point Partners for grant funding. Remember, you can support the Waterloop nonprofit media outlet at patreon.com/thewaterloop. To find all episodes, sign up for email updates, and connect on social media, visit waterloop.org.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.